There is a real contrast, though, between what the president has proposed and what we as Republicans have proposed. We talk about and have presented a plan that actually balances the budget. Betty, this is just not true with the president and the Senate. And I think if you start out with the premise that deficit spending into perpetuity is okay, then they succeeded in that. But I can't saddle up with that. It's not right for our children and our grandchildren.
Well, to respond to that, Democratic Maryland Congressman Chris Van Hollen is joining me. He's the ranking member of the House Budget Committee, often talked about as one of the best budget minds for his party, joining us from the Hill. And Congressman, what is your response to what Congressman Ridgel just said?
Well, Betty, the president's focus in his budget is on getting the economy kicked into a higher gear, getting more Americans back to work, and reducing our long-term deficits in a steady, credible, and balanced way. By the end of the 10-year window, the president's plan would reduce deficits to 1.7% of GDP, well below projected economic growth then, and that results in the debt to GDP ratio on a downward trajectory. So the contrast between the two budgets
though, by the way, still in the high 70s, that debt to GDP ratio, but lower than where it is now.
That's right, and coming down. The Republican budget, by contrast, would create an immediate drag on the economy now because it doubles down on the sequester for all non-defense discretionary spending. In other words, overall, they keep the sequester levels of spending in effect,
right.
And that, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, will result in 750,000 fewer jobs this year alone. So the president's focus is, let's get the economy moving faster now, reduce the long-term deficit in a measured, smart way. His overriding objective is economic growth both now and in the future.
But, Congressman, the president had said before the sequester, the budget cuts kicked in, that this would be an absolute dangerous and drastic hit to the economy. And the problem is that so far, weeks into this, the American people have not felt that. So how can you convince Americans that if they go with the Republican budget, that there really would be a huge drag, even a recession from that budget?
Well, I'm not saying there is going to be a recession, but what we've said is it will be a drag on economic growth.
Well, some of your colleagues are saying that.
Well, look, it was never the case that the sky was going to fall the day the sequester went into effect. But I can give you a real-world example from my district. I have the CEO of a major biotech company wrote to me and said, they have applied a hiring freeze as a result of the sequester. The only place they're hiring is in China, not because of lower wages in China, but because the Chinese government looked at the United States model of investing in bioscience and said, hey, that's a good economic growth strategy. So while the Chinese are copying our successful model to our detriment, we're actually throttling back. That is a mistake. It's a mistake to cut back on our investment in science and research and our investment in infrastructure. Things are important to help our economy grow.
I'm curious, what did you say to that CEO then?
I said we're working very hard to try and replace the sequester, and that's exactly what the president's budget does, whereas the Republican budget, as I said, more than doubles the sequester cuts in these areas of science and research, R&D, things that have been a proven helpful strategy to U.S. competitiveness.
But, Congressman, there's an op-ed, I referred to this one earlier, Alan Blinder, who's a very reasonable voice on economics and the budget. And what he said was that, look, he gives the Obama budget a pretty good grade, but he says the insistence on revenue, on increases, tax increases, just don't reflect political reality.
Well, that's interesting, and I have great respect for Alan Binder, but the reality is what the president is saying is what Speaker Boehner had said to the president in their earlier negotiations. Not the total amount of additional revenue, but remember, Speaker Boehner during the December negotiations talked about $1 trillion in revenue. The president, through the fiscal cliff agreement, had about $600 billion in revenue. So even if you were to take Speaker Boehner's proposal from last December, that's another $400 billion, and Speaker Boehner said you could get it by closing and limiting tax expenditures for high-end individuals. And Mitt Romney talked about finding trillions of dollars in revenue. Now, he was going to apply every dollar of that to rate reductions, but every bipartisan commission has